Hello everyone, my name is Vivian Daniel and I did my research paper on the influence of Christianity upon mental health care, specifically in the 1800s as a result of something that is called the moral treatment movement. The title of my paper is Becoming Human Again, the effects and influence of the moral treatment in the history of mental health care. Now, I believe that that because of the moral treatment movement, the quality and care that was given to mental patients in asylums and mental institutions greatly increased as a result of the moral treatment movement. And to really dive more into that, we have to look back at the origins of compassion and charity. And as we know from our readings in our class, that stems all the way back to Jesus. And Jesus came and he healed the sick, and he spoke to people, and he came to the people in such a way that had never been done before. He showed true compassion and true charity by giving to those who could not give anything to him in return. And because of Jesus's example that he set, the early church then took that and continued his work by caring for the sick, the elderly, the dying, the orphans, and the mentally ill. It was actually through the church that the first mental institutions were actually founded. In fact, they originated in monasteries where the monks would take in the mentally ill and care for them, and through that developed mental institutions and specific places to care for those kinds of people. But unfortunately, as time went on, the church began to become lax in their convictions about how people should be treated. And because of that, the treatment for those in mental institutions greatly digressed. They began to be treated like animals or even criminals. They were locked up and held in prisons, and they were chained, and there were some instances where they were even held in such small confinements where their muscles began to atrophy and they lost their ability to use their limbs because of a lack of activity. Now, while this was the most prevalent way that people were treated in mental institutions, there were some Christians who saw that as the horror that it is, and saw it as a complete departure from what Jesus had initially provided an example for in the way that he cared for people and the way that we should care for others. One of the first people who it's documented that actually did something about this went by the name, or his name was William Tuke, and he was a Quaker, and he actually got this conviction from God due to his own personal experience and witnessing of the horrible treatment that patients in mental institutions were receiving. He had a friend who became mentally ill and was placed in an asylum, and as he went and visited this friend, as time went on, he saw them just mentally deteriorate and continue to deteriorate until they eventually died due to malnutrition and lack of care. he saw this and was horrified and decided to do something about it. So he actually founded an institution, or he called it a refuge, called the York Retreat. And they brought in the mentally ill and cared for them in such a way that provided security. They treated them not like animals or criminals, but like family. They gave them chores and responsibilities and treated them maybe more like children in a family, so that they had goals and things to work towards to actually reach for and attain health, and maybe even eventually being cured because of such care. That institution, that retreat, was one of the first places that the moral treatment movement was first seen. Someone else who took on that example was a man by the name of Felipe Pinel. Now, he actually originally was going to be a pastor, but he was affected by what he had seen in mental institutions and decided he needed to do something about it. So he actually became a superintendent of an asylum, and he went into the asylum and changed their policies to where their patients were no longer allowed to be chained like criminals. They were released and were allowed to go outside, and in the same way that the York Retreat did, they gave their patients responsibilities and chores and treated them like human beings in the way that they should be, because they were humans, and so they should be treated as such. One final person that really stood out to me in my research was a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix. Now, she was really incredible. She went around to several states in the United States, and she spoke to the different legislatures and petitioning them to change the laws about the treatment of those in mental health care institutions. And it was through a lot of her work that people's minds began to shift and change, and Christians began to wake up a little bit more and say, this is wrong. There was a quote by her that I found that I really loved, so I'm going to share that with you. She says, "I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. I come to place before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, and the outcast. I come as the advocate of the helpless, forgotten, insane men and women, of beings sunk to a condition from which the unconcerned world would start with real horror." And I love that, because I feel like that's such a reflection of Jesus, in Jesus saying that he came to heal the sick and to advocate for us before the Father. And so those are just few examples of Christians who saw what was wrong and decided to do something about it and to step up and change it. And it is through their work that the moral treatment movement actually became more common and more seen in institutions. And it just really changed the way that people were cared for in those institutions. And it really just implemented the practices of treating people with common human kindness and courtesy. They, instead of being chained up and left in cells to rot, they were instead let they were able to go outside, and they were able to garden and read, and they actually encouraged the patients to read books. And this actually began a new form of therapy that is still used today, called bibliotherapy, where people they give the patients books to read, and this engages the mind and allows them to actively participate in their treatment and in their own personal care, and gives them, as I said before, goals to reach for, to be able to actually attain their health. And one of the biggest things that the moral treatment movement accomplished was, before it was implemented, people's view of the mentally ill was very limited. They saw those in mental institutions as people who were completely incurable, without hope. But through the moral treatment movement, not only did the quality of care change, but public perception changed, because there was a rise in cases of patients actually getting better and being able to be released from their institutions as healthy, whole human beings. Now, there are some people who debate the validity of the moral treatment movement and debate whether or not it was actually helpful, because they say that while it did remove the physical chains that held the patients, they say that it instead placed invisible chains of dependency upon the patients that were much more difficult to remove. They said that the moral treatment therapy actually caused such a dependency upon the doctors and the nurses and the staff that the patients were unable to grow and be able to function in society. Now, while this may be partially true, I do not believe that it changes the fact that the moral treatment movement shifted people's views and shifted the treatment given to patients. Regardless of human error and sin, God's nature and his principles of kindness and compassion and charity and the sanctity of human life will never change. And as the church, even though we fail and we fall and we don't adequately reflect God's nature at times, we should take after the example of those who have come before us and take a stand against the things that we see that are contrary to God's nature, and stand up for the things that God has called us to defend, especially in areas of the sanctity of human life and for caring for those who cannot care for themselves. Anyways, that is my research paper. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I have really enjoyed this class and getting to know some of you guys. A huge thank you to our professor for teaching this class. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really hope that you guys have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year, and all that good stuff. Thanks. Bye.